What I want to talk about today is, I want you to focus for a few seconds on this photo. This is my grandfather, Michael. Ignore the vase, I'm sure we have it somewhere in my house. But my grandfather I never got a chance to meet because he died when I was 2 years old. But speaking to people about this talk, which was very insightful for me, I got to find out that he was a very kind person, and he would never harm anybody, and he was well-traveled and well-versed, although he was uneducated. But something that he was, which was weird for me, was that he was the seventh son of a seventh son. Take a step back, think about it. He had 6 brothers, he was the youngest one, and his father had 6 brothers, who he was the youngest one. Which means that we had huge celebrations at Christmas, to start with. But as some of you may know, I don't know, do we have any 7 sons in the audience, or? Thought so. As some of you may know, a 7th son is considered to be somebody with special powers in many different cultures, in many different countries, in many different religions. And it ranges from being a healer, somebody who can help you fix things about yourself and recover. It's somebody who can see the future, so you're a future teller or a fortune teller sometimes. And in some countries, you're a werewolf. Now, I can guarantee you that my family never saw my grandfather doing anything weird on that regard. But in Argentina, in particular, being a werewolf is a big concern. So what they do there is that they will ask you to go to the presidential palace, and they will get the president to christen you. So just to give you an idea, Juan Perón actually christened 1,982 kids during his 3 terms as the president of Argentina. So that meant that you didn't become a werewolf. You were gifted, because you were now the godson of the president. You were given some land, and you were given privilege, and you were in a special position in your life. Now, my grandfather unfortunately wasn't born in Argentina. So he was born in Cyprus, which effectively meant that he was 1 kid too many. So we had too many in the family. So what he did was that he had to emigrate. And just to put you into the context of time, this was straight after the Great War, what we know now as the World War, the First World War. Clearly at the time there wasn't the second, so it was the Great War. And he was part of a generation which was lost. They had no vision, no dreams, no future. 8 million people died. These people were in poverty, in famine. Europe was in even worse situation than it is now. And what my grandfather did was, on the 14th of May, 1920, he got to a ship called the RMS Pannonia, which left from Patra to go to Naples, to go to Valencia, to eventually go to Ellis Island. Now, this was just putting it, again, in the context of time. You're talking about big steamships that you're talking about 840 people on there. 40 of them were in first class. 800, like my grandfather, were effectively next to the engine room. And it was a tough one because you had rough waters. You were in a sticky environment with a lot of crowded people, smelly people, people you didn't want to be with. So when you arrived at Ellis Island, that was a bit of a blessing for you. And it all took 24 days. So you were in a situation where you're in a stuffy room 24 days. And Ellis Island, ironically, was called by an estate agent as a pleasantly situated island when he tried to sell it. And it was a place where they used to hang pirates and convicted criminals. So you arrive at this place, and it's a very welcoming place at the time that my grandfather went. And you came into a room like this one, and you had a huge staircase. And this staircase would take you into the Great Hall, which was a room more or less 5 times the size of this room. And you needed to go up these stairs, and eventually you would get asked a lot of questions, 29 questions to be precise. Where are you coming from? What do you do? Why are you here? Why do you want to stay in America? And the purpose of this was twofold. The first one was to figure out who can go up these stairs, and a lot of people would get rejected as a result and sent back home, heartbroken. And secondly, they would ask all these questions to make sure you were not a burden on society at the time. And my grandfather ended up going through, and if you get through, you would get into a small boat, and the small boat would take you across the bay to Manhattan. And that's the first piece of outdoor advertising you ever saw, which was the Statue of Liberty. And that was there, was specifically placed there, so all these immigrants would see the Statue of Liberty and feel that I'm part of this welcoming new nation, that I'm part of a nation that will give me my own American dream. And somehow, which I don't know why, I've researched it, but I couldn't find the reason, my grandfather ended up in Pittsburg. Now, I don't know how many of you know Pittsburg. Pittsburg is on the western side of Pennsylvania. It's quite far from New York, but he ended up going and joining one of the biggest steel mills of the time, actually the biggest mill of the time. This was owned by Andrew Carnegie, that many of you may know, who was the wealthiest guy at that time. So Pittsburgh, just to give you an idea, at the time, it was buzzing. It was the beginning of the jazz era. They had Art Deco. Women were allowed to vote for the first time. Women were wearing skirts up to here, which was a big revelation at the time. So it was a very buzzing community, and it was one that invited a lot of immigrants coming in. There was all these mixtures of cultures, and it was the era of the Great Gatsby. If you've seen the film, that's what it was. And just to give you an idea, 2 blocks from where my grandfather lived, and it's amazing with Google Maps, you can actually find the exact location, which I did. 2 blocks from there was a company called Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. And that came to become a place of history, because on the 2nd of November, a guy called Conrad, together with a few of his colleagues, did the first radio live broadcast. And this was the night of the elections, presidential elections at the time. They went up to the roof, they took a cable with them, they listened into all these various telephone lines and actually announced the election results. And this was fantastic because you're talking about a time that people had no radio. 1,000 people actually listened to this show. And how do they know? Because they asked people to send postcards. So 1,000 postcards came back. And about 10 years later, we had the evolution of the radio era. You had 12 million radios being around in every household. And similar to the internet now, within 20 years, every single household had a radio. So Pittsburgh was an amazing place to be. It was, I would say, the Silicon Valley of its time. So that got me thinking, why is it that Pittsburgh became that? Why not the next city? What is it that made Pittsburgh so special? And are there any learnings for us, especially in Greece these days, that can help understand what was going on? And I think the biggest observation, and there were many reasons, like always, there's many reasons why a country or a town will go to that level of innovation and development, but the main reason for Pittsburgh was immigrants. Pittsburgh grew in size about 7 times at the turn of the century. That's a lot of people. There were thousands and thousands of people coming from Europe, bringing the cultures, the languages, the races, the color skins, everything into a melting pot, which at the time was called Pittsburgh. And these guys were driven, they were passionate, they were pioneers. Remember the ones that couldn't make it up the stairs or didn't answer correctly one of the 29 questions were not allowed in. So this was a natural selection going on. And these people, when they got to Pittsburgh, it was exciting, it was buzzing, the war had just ended, people came back. About 2 million troops actually came back, and they settled, and they wanted to settle families and to start consuming, and that was an amazing start, which is more or less the opposite of what we see right now in Europe. So when I started looking into this, and I said, okay, well, these immigrants clearly had an impact, I realized that there were 3 main reasons why immigrants were different. And the first one was they had guts, they were fearless. So these guys, think about it, my granddad was 17. He came into a new country not speaking the language. He was not educated. He didn't have any special skills. He didn't know anybody. So his core network, as it is called, he didn't have it there. So he needed to reach out to people that he didn't know. He needed to reach out to what a lot of sociologists these days call the weak links. And these are the people that you may have met once, maybe twice, maybe somebody you know knows them, but you don't know them directly. There was a lot of research on that in the 70s. And what that research proved was that these weak links are actually much more important most times than your core. And they studied a bunch of job seekers, and they asked them, how did you find your job? And the answer was, somebody I've only met once. So what was great about the immigrants at the time, they were fearless. And they reached out to all these weak links in the networks, and they mobilized them. And that was something that really helped them. But the second one, and a very important point, was that they became amazing connectors. I don't know if you've watched the TED Talk by Malcolm Gladwell or if you read his books, but he is spending a lot of time on the focus on the concept of a connector. And there was a lot of research done, Robert Burton, a bunch of others, that talked about how diverse groups of people, it's better to be the connector between 2 very diverse groups rather than being the most connected person in one of them. And this has actually had an impact with entrepreneurs, with immigrants, where most of them became entrepreneurs. They started speaking with other cultures, with other races. They needed to adapt. They didn't speak the language, they had to learn it, so they listened much more. And they became much more aware of what other cultures, how they behaved. They were much more open. And the third one is, when you come into a new country, you start thinking for the long term. So you start thinking about, I'm going to build these relationships, but I need to give and take. It's not just taking from this new society. Because if you are marked as somebody who just takes, you're usually being excluded from the system. And there was an interesting book that came out in 1987, The Go-Giver, by Bob Berg, where he talks about the art of giving and the art of giving before taking. So these guys, when you think about it, they were fearless. They came into a country they didn't know. The second one was that they were amazing connectors. And clearly the third one, they were thinking for long-term relationships rather than transactional. So I started thinking that, okay, well, does that mean that Pittsburgh was an exception, or have we seen this elsewhere in the world? And I don't know how many of you guys know this company, but if you don't, you should go home and read about it. This is the beginning of Silicon Valley. So in the middle of the 1950s, there were 8 people that started Fairchild Semiconductor. And what's amazing about this company is that they started 92 companies directly as a result of this venture. So they were hugely successful as a company, but they gave enough money and invested in new ventures and all that for 92 different companies. And 92 different companies that generated value of 2.1 trillion. Just to put it again in perspective, this is bigger than the size of the GDP of India. What's really interesting about these guys is that 5 of the guys that you see in that photo, 5 of the 8 were actually immigrants. And you look at Silicon Valley today, and we heard a talk before from PayPal, and you look at the PayPal mafia. Peter Thiel is German. You look at Elon Musk, he's South African-Canadian. You look at Reid Hoffman, even Reid Hoffman, who's American, spent a lot of time abroad. So it's this immigrant mentality that you introduce into an ecosystem like Silicon Valley, like Pittsburgh, that makes a difference. And you look at the stats now, and they're there. 52% of the new startups in Silicon Valley were founded by immigrants. 40% of the publicly listed companies founded by immigrants. You look at the patents, 25% of the patents were held by people that were not born in the United States. And there's other examples. Israel is a classic one. Israel is a startup nation, effectively. You're talking about a country that was populated by immigrants by definition. 40% of the people living in Israel were not born there. And you look at the stats there, and it's 3,500 tech startups. That's 3 times as many as Silicon Valley. And you look at the NASDAQ, and you see the 3 countries that are the top of that league is the US, is China, and then it's Israel. And Israel, just to remind everybody, is as small as Cyprus, effectively, is 100th smallest nation in the world. If you took Israel and you lifted it and you put it in Europe, you can put 459 of them. So when you start looking at these examples, you realize that Greece is a broken country. It's a country that's going through a crisis, as we all know. A financial crisis, a social crisis, a crisis of values. And I think we've run out of good ideas. We've run out of new ideas. It's a country that is going through a rethinking process in itself, in rooms like this one, but not at the great level. And when you actually look at Greece right now, from an outsider's perspective, and I only came to this country 4 years ago, but if you look at it from an outsider's perspective, you start wondering, have we become too complacent? Have we lost the ability to communicate? Have we lost the ability to innovate and think of new ideas? And my view is that we've become a bit of an insular society. You look at Greece right now, and we don't know how to communicate, even at the political level. We don't know how to communicate internally. We don't reach out to these weak ties of ours. And when you look at that, together with my business partner, when we came here, we said, is there a future for this country, or are we totally screwed? And I think for us, it was quite important to understand, and to give you some perspective, how difficult it is to set up a business in Greece. Emilios and I came to Greece 4.5 years ago. To set up an insurance business, we needed to reach out to 2,500 investors in order to get the capital we needed to start. That was 300 meetings in 14 different countries. And it took us 18 months without a salary in order to complete that. And not only that, but in those 18 months, it took us a lot of bureaucracy, as you would expect. So it took us 3 years from the time that we actually left our job to the time that we actually sold our first policy. And during that time, there was a change of 5 prime ministers, 7 ministers of finance. Now, anybody who tells you that it's difficult to start a business in Greece, trust me, it is. But there's one thing that keeps it going, and one thing that we focus quite a lot on, which is the people that we hire. And I think my generation is screwed, to be very honest, in Greece. But the generation that we see, the Y generation, the guys who are now between 20 and 25, they're a different tribe. These guys are much grounded. They have better expectations, much more real in everything they do. And I think when Emilios and I started hiring people, we were looking for that immigrant mentality. We were looking at that mindset, that it doesn't matter where you were born, but to bear that mindset. And I think what we've realized from our experience, and if anybody is starting their own business, by all means do, but look out for these trades. You need to get people that are young. It's better to teach than to reform somebody. especially if you're going to go after a sector that needs to be reformed from the very beginning. So you need new experiences rather than old. You look at our company right now, we have a beekeeper, as I found out the other day. We have a drone enthusiast. We have a number of different people. The most important thing is to be passionate. And I think a lot of these people that we hire are very, very passionate, not only about what they do, but about life. And I think that is, again, that migrant mentality that you see. And the third one, the third trait that we've seen from our side that is necessary for Greece is we need to learn how to fail. And a lot of the people that we hired, they come from the Greek educational system, which is the same problem in Europe, it's not just here, that we are protected in an environment of passive learning where you don't appreciate the value of trying, failing, and starting again. And I think one of the things that we do differently at our company is we give people the opportunity to fail. And it's an opportunity because you're there, you're holding their hand, you're helping them fail, and after they fail, they get up again, and they're much stronger, which is a very big cliche, but especially in Greece, it is something that I think is quite important. Back to Pittsburgh. What happened to that? Elections come in, Warren Harding gets elected with the most popular vote of all times. He got 60.3%, 25% margin from the number 2. He was a conservative with a very aggressive conservative agenda. From his perspective, he wanted a return to normalcy, which effectively meant stop the immigration, stop new ideas coming in. Let's return back to those American-rooted ideas that we had before all these foreigners came in. Ku Klux Klan was a group that was more or less banished until the beginning of the century. Right now, they were the most popular ever. They had 5 million members. And these are not empathizers. These are actual registered members. You look at violence. They had protests all over the place, talking about minimum wage, talking about the conditions in those steel mills, like the one that my grandfather was. And you look at that environment and you say, one choice that the American people made at that point in time determined whether the US would go in the positive way or a negative way. And that effectively led to the Great Depression down the line. Now, Pittsburgh became the battleground of these two forces. It was the progressive forces and the conservative ones. It was the forces of people that accepted change and wanted change, and the people that could not take it, could not handle it. And there were the people that were afraid. They were open, and the people that were afraid of immigrants, of new ideas, of everything coming in. And I think there's a lot of learnings from that we can take as Greece, as Europe, as the world right now. TED is all about looking forward and trying to reimagine our future rather than trying to relive our past. And there's a lot of talks today which were super interesting, and there's a lot of things that we touched upon on this presentation, some of it relevant, some of it not. But I think if there's one message that I want you guys to take away with you this evening, is that we need to open our minds. We need to start rethinking and thinking differently. When you look at the way that we have been thinking in this country, is a very backward way. We need to start building that aspiration. We need to start thinking more like the 1920s immigrants. We need to start being fearless. We need to start connecting with people. We need to start building for the longer term. Thank you.